It was a Sunday morning in early autumn, that kind of morning that makes one believe the world is still gentle. The sky above St. Mary Mead was the color of porcelain, thin clouds drifting like lace. From every chimney came the thin, straight plume of smoke that spoke of bacon and coal fires, and in every lane there was the brisk tapping of shoes as villagers made their way towards St. Mary's Church. The bell had been ringing steadily for 10 minutes when Miss Jane Marple drew on her gloves, smoothed the ribbon of her hat, and stepped out from her front gate. The air smelled of wet leaves and honeysuckle. She smiled as she noticed the vicar's young curate cycling ahead, cassock flapping like a black sail. Morning prayer at St. Mary's was a tradition older than anyone could quite recall. To Miss Marple, it was less about ritual and more about observation. Church, she often thought, was an excellent place to study human nature. People believed themselves unseen when their heads were bowed. Inside, sunlight streamed through the stained glass window depicting the Good Shepherd. Dust motes shimmered in the beams, and the air carried that particular blend of beeswax polish and hymn book leather. The congregation settled into familiar pews. The Bennets near the front, the Lanes to the right, and Connell Arkwright at the back where he could stretch his bad knee. Miss Marple took her usual seat halfway down on the left, where she could observe without appearing to. She nodded pleasantly to Mrs. Price Ridley, who offered a tight-lipped smile in return. The organist, Mr. Hewlett, adjusted his spectacles and began the opening hymn, "Praise, my soul, the King of Heaven." Voices rose and fell. The rhythm of devotion filled the church. Everything was serene, until the scream. It came just as the final note of the hymn faded. A single, piercing cry echoed from the north transept, a woman's voice, high and terrified, the kind of sound that freezes the blood, because it does not belong in a house of God. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Mrs. Hartnell, a broad-shouldered woman, clutched her husband's arm. The curate dropped his prayer book. The vicar, the Reverend Clement, hurried down the aisle, his face pale beneath his clerical collar. Miss Marple rose, steady despite her years. She could tell at once that the scream had come not from hysteria but from shock. Real, sudden, terrible shock. In the north transept, a small group had gathered around one of the side pews. Miss Marple made her way through, murmuring apologies until she could see. There, slumped forward against the wood, was Mrs. Lydia Penrith, a newcomer to the village, graceful, fashionably dressed, and recently arrived to take possession of the old rectory with her husband, Major Penrith. But it was not Mrs. Penrith who had screamed. It was the housemaid, a timid girl of 19, now trembling as she pointed toward the figure seated beside her mistress. Major Penrith sat perfectly still, eyes open, lips faintly parted. Dead. Reverend Clement checked for a pulse, then drew back, shaking his head. "He's gone," he murmured. "Good heavens, he's gone." The congregation pressed closer, whispering in scandalized tones. Connell Arkwright barked for space. Miss Hartnell fanned herself furiously. Lydia Penrith's face had drained of color, but she neither wept nor fainted. She simply stared at her husband as if unable to believe the evidence of her eyes. Miss Marple's keen gaze moved from the body to the surroundings. Nothing seemed disturbed. The prayer books were neatly stacked, the pew cushion unruffled. But there was a faint, sweet odor, oddly out of place. "Almonds." She filed that away. "Carl Dr. Haydock," she said softly. At once, arrival of Dr. Haydock within 15 minutes. Dr. Haydock arrived, gruff, practical, the sort of man who regarded emotion as a symptom. He examined the body, frowning. No sign of struggle. No injury. "I'd say heart failure, but..." He sniffed the air. "Do you smell that, Jane?" "Bitter almonds." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed I do." The doctor's eyes met hers. "Cyanide, perhaps." "Perhaps," she echoed. Dr. Haydock straightened. "We'd better notify the police. If it's what I think, this isn't a matter for the parish anymore." The Reverend Clement crossed himself reflexively. "In church, of all places," he whispered. "What an abominable thing." Gossip spreads by midday. Word had travelled the length and breadth of St. Mary Mead. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby declared it was a judgment from heaven. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Peters insisted he'd seen Major Penrith quarrelling with someone outside the previous evening. And at the Vicarage, Griselda Clement, ever the modern wife, was already arranging tea for the inspector. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her parlour window knitting. Her needles clicked rhythmically, the motion soothing her thoughts. She knew human behavior like others knew embroidery patterns. Every detail had meaning if one only looked closely enough. The scream, she considered, had come after the final hymn, precisely timed, perhaps when most attention was elsewhere. The bitter, almond smell suggested poison, likely administered beforehand. But when, and by whom? A sudden death in church was convenient reverent hush, communal distraction, and the ready assumption of divine will. Introduction of key suspects. By late afternoon, Inspector Craddock had arrived from Milchester, courteous as ever. He listened as the Reverend Clement recounted events, then took brief statements from those nearest the victim. Mrs. Lydia Penrith, widow now, spoke with composed sorrow. My husband had not been well, Inspector. He suffered from nerves after the war. The doctor advised rest, but he would insist on attending service. I can hardly think. Miss Marple noted the controlled tone. No tears, not even trembling fingers. Either extraordinary restraint or something else entirely. Next came Colonel Arkwright, who claimed he had known the Major from army circles. Fine fellow, bit of a temper. Mind you, we had words about the parish council last week. Nothing serious. Mrs. Hartnell volunteered her opinion uninvited. That poor man was a saint, always polite to everyone, unlike some wives I could mention. She darted a meaningful glance toward Lydia Penrith. Then there was Mr. Hewlett, the organist, mild balding, and devoted to his music. He insisted he had noticed nothing odd, though Miss Marple later recalled how his hands had shaken when he turned a hymn page. Finally, the young maid, Nellie Trent, pale and tearful, described bringing a thermos of coffee to the Penriths' pew before service. A habit, she said, for the Major's weak constitution. Coffee, thought Miss Marple. Coffee with a hint of almonds. Miss Marple's quiet observations. When the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the empty church. The afternoon light slanted across the pews, revealing every grain of polished wood. She examined the thermos left near the transept rail. Inside was a residue, faintly cloudy. She replaced it exactly as she found it. The police would, of course, send it for analysis, but Jane Marple's mind already traced the outline of the puzzle. If cyanide it was, the means of administration would be simple. But the opportunity, during morning prayer, all eyes were front. Only those near the Penriths' pew could have tampered with anything. Yet the coffee had been brought earlier by Nellie. Who might have intercepted it? Her thoughts were interrupted by footsteps. The Reverend Clement approached, looking troubled. Miss Marple, he said quietly, it seems dreadful to ask, but do you think it was murder? My dear Reverend, she said gently, when one encounters a scream during morning prayer, and the scent of almonds upon the air, one must at least consider the possibility. Evening reflections. That evening, the village lay under a hush of scandal. Curtains twitched, lamps glowed behind lace. The inquest would be arranged, of course, but Miss Marple doubted it would be so straightforward. Men like Major Penrith did not simply expire mid-hymn without reason. She recalled little things, the way Mrs. Penrith had avoided looking at the curate, how the organist's eyes had darted to the side door, how the colonel's voice had quavered slightly when asked his whereabouts before the service. Patterns, she thought. Human patterns. She sat by the hearth, tea steaming at her elbow, and began a new line of knitting. Each stitch was deliberate, precise, like the steps of her reasoning. Somewhere between the click of the needles and the purring of her cat, Miss Marple smiled faintly. People, she murmured, hair so very revealing when they believe themselves in the presence of the Almighty. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, and in the distance, down the silent lane toward the old rectory, a dog began to howl, long, mournful, and strangely human. The peace of St. Mary Mead had been broken, and Jane Marple knew that before it was restored, someone else's secret would be laid bare. The next morning dawned pale and misty over St. Mary Mead. The quiet village, usually so content in its rhythm of gossip and gardening, now carried a tension one could almost taste in the air. People walked more quickly, curtains opened just a fraction later than usual. A death in church had shaken even the most composed of souls. At the vicarage, the Reverend Clement's breakfast went cold as Griselda read aloud from the morning paper. The report was mercifully brief. Sudden death during Sunday service, cause under investigation. But it was enough to set tongues wagging from the post office to the greengrocer's. Meanwhile, across the lane, Miss Jane Marple stirred her tea with unhurried grace. She had been awake since dawn, thinking. Death, she always felt, was seldom sudden to those who knew how to look. The signs were there, if one had the patience to observe. Inspector Craddock's arrival by mid-morning. Inspector Craddock had taken over the small reading room at the vicarage as his temporary headquarters. His manner was brisk but courteous, the same gentlemanly professionalism Miss Marple had come to admire on previous occasions. He rose when she entered. Ah, Miss Marple, I was hoping you'd drop by. You always seem to notice what others miss. I only notice what people forget to conceal," she said, smiling. "May I sit?" "Of course." He shuffled through his papers. "We've got the preliminary report from Dr. Craddock. Cyanide poisoning beyond doubt. The residue in the thermos confirms it." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "I feared as much. The question," Craddock continued, "is how it got there, and who had the chance. The maid, Nellie Trent, says she prepared the coffee early and left it by the side table in the vestry while she arranged hymn books. Claims she returned 10 minutes later, fetched it, and brought it to the major. Only a few people would have passed through that way in that time." He ticked them off on his fingers. "The Reverend Clement, of course, the organist, Hewlett, the curate, Mr. Barnes, Mrs. Hartnell, who says she came in to fetch her spectacles, and perhaps Lydia Penrith herself." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And what of Colonel Arkwright? Nowhere near the vestry, by his account, arrived late, 2 minutes before the hymn. But no one saw him come in. A visit to the old rectory after lunch." Miss Marple decided that a visit to the bereaved widow was in order. It was, after all, the Christian thing to do, and, more practically, one never learned so much about the living as when they spoke of the dead. The old rectory stood at the edge of the village, half shrouded in ivy, its windows gleaming in the thin autumn sun. Lydia Penrith received Miss Marple in a drawing-room that smelled faintly of lilies. Her black dress was immaculate, her posture flawless, but there were deep shadows under her eyes. "You are kind to call, Miss Marple," she said softly. "It's all been such a dreadful shock." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. "Indeed, dear. To lose one's husband in such circumstances, most distressing." Lydia's gaze flickered toward the window. "The inspector believes it was poison. But who could have done such a thing? We were strangers here. We had no enemies." "Strangers," Miss Marple echoed. "Sometimes strangers provoke more curiosity than they realize. Forgive me, my dear, but your husband, was he quite himself lately?" Lydia hesitated. "He had been nervous, restless. The war left its mark as it did on many men. He was easily irritated, especially by trivialities, but he meant no harm." Her voice faltered. Miss Marple watched closely. There was sincerity in the tone, but also something guarded, a layer of self-control that spoke of deeper anxieties. "Had he been taking any medicines?" Miss Marple asked casually. "A tonic from Dr. Craddock, I believe, for the nerves. I can show you the bottle if you wish." But Miss Marple waved it off gently. "That won't be necessary. I was merely wondering whether he might have mistaken something poisonous for something harmless." At that, Lydia gave a faint smile. "You mean suicide?" "Oh no, Miss Marple. My husband would never take his own life. He was far too proud for that." The organist's secret. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the cool, shadowed nave of St. Mary's. The organist, Mr. Hewlett, was practicing alone, the deep chords echoing like sighs through the rafters. She waited until he finished the hymn before speaking. "A dreadful business, Mr. Hewlett." He jumped slightly. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in." "No doubt your music carried you away," she said kindly. "Tell me, had you known Major Penrith well?" He rubbed his hands with a handkerchief. "Barely at all. He wasn't a churchman, not really. Came only because his wife insisted. I doubt he knew one psalm from another." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "Yet you seemed quite shaken yesterday." He turned pale. Well, anyone would be. Dying in church, it's monstrous." "Quite so," she said. "Still, I thought I saw you look toward the vestry door just before the scream. Did something catch your attention?" Hewlett hesitated. I thought I saw someone standing there. A shadow, perhaps. Could have been the curate. Or, well, I'm not sure, but not Mrs. Penrith." "No, certainly not her. She was in her pew." The Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Hewlett. Shadows often tell us more than they intend." Gossip over tea. By evening, Miss Marple had gathered more than a few fragments of conversation. At Mrs. Hartnell's tea party, ostensibly arranged for comfort and mutual support, the women of the village aired their theories as freely as their opinions. "Mark my words, Mrs. Price," Ridley said darkly, "that poor man was done in by his own wife. They were never happy, not since she came to the village with all those airs." "Nonsense," sniffed Mrs. Hartnell. "If you ask me, it was that sly little maid, always hanging about with her head down. The quiet ones are the worst." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You both make very interesting points," she said mildly. "Though sometimes people's behavior after a tragedy is as revealing as before." "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Weatherby. "Oh, nothing in particular," said Miss Marple, her eyes innocent. "Only that Mrs. Penrith seems remarkably composed for one who has lost her husband so suddenly, and Colonel Arkwright seems to have acquired a most touching concern for her welfare." The table went silent. Then the murmurs began again, lower and sharper this time. Miss Marple hid a smile behind her teacup. Gossip, properly directed, was like wind on embers. It brought hidden things to light. A strange discovery that night. The churchwarden, Mr. Peck, arrived breathless at the vicarage, insisting that something most peculiar had been found near the vestry. Inspector Craddock summoned Miss Marple to accompany him. By lamplight, they examined a small leather glove lying half hidden beneath the side table where the thermos had stood. It was delicate, feminine, faintly scented with violet. "Mrs. Penrith's?" Craddock asked. "Could be," said Miss Marple, "though such gloves are common enough. Still," the inspector mused, "if she was in the vestry that morning." She failed to mention it. Miss Marple traced a finger along the glove's stitching. A woman in distress seldom remembers every detail, but sometimes what she forgets is precisely what she wishes to forget. Craddock frowned. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that most people are, Inspector." The curate's confession, the following day, brought another visit to the church, this time by Mr. Barnes, the young curate, who requested a private word with Miss Marple after the service. His boyish face was pale and troubled. "Miss Marple," he began, twisting his hat in his hands, "I'm afraid I may have seen something I shouldn't." "Indeed," she prompted. "It was just before the service. I went into the vestry to fetch the processional cross, and I saw Mrs. Penrith there. She seemed upset. She was pouring something into a small cup, and when she noticed me, she startled and dropped the bottle into her handbag. She said it was smelling salts, but—" He hesitated. "The label was red." "Red labels," Miss Marple said softly, "usually warn of danger. I didn't think much of it then," the curate confessed. "But now, good heavens, if she—" "Steady yourself, Mr. Barnes," she said kindly. "Supposition helps no one. But you've done right to speak." He looked miserable. "You won't tell the inspector, will you?" "Not yet. I shall tell him what he needs to know," said Miss Marple. "When he needs to know it." Late night reflection. That evening, rain swept through the village, drumming softly on Miss Marple's windows. She sat with her notebook open, jotting small, precise thoughts. Facts known: death by cyanide during morning prayer. Coffee brought by maid, left unattended in vestry. Mrs. Penrith seen there briefly, red labeled bottle. Glove found beneath table. Bitter almonds confirmed by Dr. Haydock. Colonel Arkwright oddly protective of widow. Questions remaining: source of poison, motive, who had access to vestry during interval. She considered each in turn. Cyanide was not easily come by, yet gardeners used it in certain fumigation powders. Colonel Arkwright had a fine greenhouse at his cottage, did he not? And the Major's war nerves. Were they truly the whole story, or a polite phrase for domestic strife? Outside, thunder muttered across the downs. Miss Marple set down her pen. Something subtle, did not fit. If Lydia Penrith were guilty, she had chosen a time and place most likely to ensure discovery. That was rarely the mark of a calculating murderer. Unless, of course, discovery was the point. A visit to Colonel Arkwright the next day, under the pretense of delivering a parish notice, Miss Marple paid a call on Colonel Arkwright. His cottage was neat, filled with trophies from distant campaigns. He greeted her with gruff cordiality. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple." The poor woman's beside herself. "I'm sure she appreciates your kindness." Miss Marple replied mildly. "You knew the Major well, I believe." "Oh yes, served together once. Good officer, if a bit headstrong. And no quarrels recently." "Good heavens, no. We had words about parish matters, but nothing to it." "Why?" Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a corner shelf, where a row of gardening supplies sat neatly in tins. One bore a red label: potassium cyanide for greenhouse use. "Ah," she said pleasantly, "I see you're fond of orchids. Such delicate creatures." He followed her glance, then cleared his throat. "Yes, need careful tending. Can't get proper fumigants these days. Everything's rationed." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "One must make do with what one has." She thanked him for the tea and left, her mind turning rapidly. A source of poison identified, and a man with opportunity, but still no motive. Unless perhaps Lydia Penrith herself was the motive. Miss Marple's insight as dusk settled. Miss Marple sat once more before her fire. She recalled every word, every gesture of the past 2 days. A woman's composure too perfect, a colonel's protectiveness too swift, an organist's trembling hands, a curate's guilty conscience. Then the thought came, clear, quiet, unmistakable. The scream. It had come after the hymn, after the poison had done its work. Yet the one who screamed, Nellie Trent, had been sitting right beside the victim. Why had she screamed then, not sooner? Because she had only then looked up. Or because she knew precisely when he would die? Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression grave. The investigation had only begun, but already she sensed the shape of deception. In St. Mary Mead, sin was seldom flamboyant. It wore polite gloves and spoke softly in church. And somewhere among those polished pews, the truth waited to be unmasked. The rain that had threatened all night finally broke over St. Mary Mead. Grey veils drifted across the fields, and puddles gathered in the lanes like fragments of dull glass. Miss Marple awoke to the steady patter on her window, and the faint chime of the church clock striking 7. She felt the peculiar anticipation that always accompanies a mystery at its most confusing stage, when every clue seems to point in 2 directions at once. She dressed, boiled her egg, and unfolded the morning paper. No new revelations, of course. Newspapers seldom understood the delicate weave of village life. But she was certain that somewhere, behind the polite condolences and whispered speculations, the truth waited. Thin as a thread, but strong enough to draw the whole pattern together. The inspector's dilemma. Inspector Craddock arrived soon after breakfast, hat dripping, expression sore. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I'm no nearer than I was yesterday. Every one of them could have done it, and not a blessed thing to prove which." Miss Marple poured him tea. "When everyone could have done it, Inspector. The question is not who could, but who needed to." He sighed. The analysis came back from London. The thermos contained a trace of cyanide mixed with coffee, strong enough to kill within minutes. The bottle found in Colonel Arkwright's shed is missing a little from the seal, but there are no fingerprints except his own. "How inconveniently tidy," Miss Marple murmured. "Have you considered the possibility of someone borrowing it?" "I have. But the Colonel swears it's been locked up." "Locks, Inspector, are like promises," she said gently. "Only useful to honest people." Craddock smiled despite himself. "You always cheer me up, Miss Marple, though I can't think why. Perhaps because you make murder sound so civilized." To the widow and the Colonel later that morning, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll through the drizzle to the old rectory. The curtains were drawn, but through a gap she glimpsed Lydia Penrith and Colonel Arkwright seated together in the drawing-room. The sight made her pause. Their posture was not that of comforter and bereaved. There was an intimacy there, restrained yet unmistakable. She stepped back quickly, lest she be seen, and continued on her way, thoughts knitting themselves faster than her needles ever could. At noon, she called upon them under the pretext of delivering a basket of flowers from the parish. Lydia thanked her politely. The Colonel busied himself with the fire. "So kind of you," Lydia said. "The village has been very considerate." "The village," Miss Marple replied, "always finds tragedy most stimulating. They are already pairing widows and colonels in their imaginations." The Colonel chuckled uneasily. "People will talk, Miss Marple. Nothing to it." "No doubt," she said mildly, eyes fixed on the bouquet. "Only one hopes they talk of the right things." When she left, the Colonel followed her to the door. "You don't believe Lydia had anything to do with this, do you?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but gave no answer. "Belief, Colonel, is a dangerous luxury in detective work. One must rely on pattern, and patterns rarely lie." The maid's tears that afternoon, Miss Marple sent for Nellie Trent, the maid who had carried the fatal thermos. The girl arrived pale and nervous, clutching a damp handkerchief. "I don't know why everyone keeps asking me," she burst out before even sitting down. "I didn't put anything in it." "I swear, my dear," said Miss Marple soothingly, "no one suggested you did. I merely wondered, has anyone spoken unkindly to you since?" Nellie sniffed. "Mrs. Hartnell said I should be ashamed to show my face. But I only did what Mrs. Penrith told me." "Mrs. Penrith told you?" "Yes, ma'am. She said the Major would want his coffee early, before the service began. Told me to take it to the vestry and leave it by the side table." Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-click. "That is very interesting. And you did so?" "Yes, but when I went back I thought the lid felt different, looser, maybe. I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple nodded. "Memory is a curious thing, Nellie. It often improves after a cup of cocoa and a good night's sleep. If anything else returns to you, will you tell me?" The girl promised, dabbing her eyes. Miss Marple watched her leave, then made a note, lid altered. Coffee early at wife's request. For a question of timing at evensong that night, Miss Marple sat in her pew while the organ rolled above her. Her mind drifted between hymn verses. Cyanide acted quickly, within seconds if taken in liquid form. Therefore, Major Penrith must have drunk the coffee shortly before his death, not long before the service began. Yet the thermos had been brought early. He had taken a sip, perhaps, then set it aside until the hymn. Why? Because someone had encouraged him to. After the service, she caught up with Reverend Coombs. "My dear Vicar," she asked softly, "do you recall seeing anyone speak to Major Penrith during the prayers?" "Now that you mention it," said the vicar, frowning. "The Colonel leaned over once, I believe, to hand him something, a pamphlet perhaps, or a cup," said Miss Marple. "Memory plays such tricks." The vicar looked startled. "You think the Colonel?" "I think," she interrupted gently, "that many hands have touched that coffee, and one of them was not innocent." 5. A letter from the past. The following morning brought a new complication. Inspector Craddock arrived with a letter, discovered among the late Major's papers. "It's from a solicitor in London," he said. "Apparently, Penrith was negotiating to change his will. He meant to leave his estate to his wife, but the new draft cuts her out entirely, leaving everything to a woman named Clara Hewlett." "Hewlett," Miss Marple repeated. "The organist's sister, exactly. She's been staying with him for a month, it seems. Lydia Penrith didn't know. Gives her motive enough, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Too neat, Inspector. Murder is seldom so convenient. Tell me, when was the letter dated?" "Last Thursday." "And was the change executed?" "No. The solicitor was waiting for the Major's signature." "Then it would never stand in court. Only the intention of a quarrelsome man." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Still, it does tell us one thing: the Major's affections were wandering. And in such cases, affections often wander back." 6. A visit to Mr. Hewlett. That afternoon Miss Marple walked to the small cottage by the green where the organist lived. The parlour smelled of sheet music and pipe smoke. Clara Hewlett, a thin, anxious woman in her 40s, received her. "I suppose everyone's talking about that letter," she said bitterly. "As if I'd wanted his money!" "I only pitied the man." Miss Marple's tone was kind. Pity can look very like affection to a lonely gentleman. "Did Mrs. Penrith know of your friendship?" Clara flushed. "I doubt it, but my brother warned me to keep clear. He said the Major was unstable. I didn't listen." "And your brother? Did he approve of the Major?" A pause. "He hated him," she whispered. "Said he'd ruined his choir and insulted him before the vestrymen. But he'd never harm anyone. He's a gentle soul." Miss Marple regarded her gently. Gentle souls have been known to play harsh notes when provoked. When she left, she noticed a faint chemical smell near the back door, like old polish, sharp and metallic. On a shelf beside the organ lay a small bottle with a red warning label. "Silver cleaning fluid," according to the faded writing. She tucked that image away in her mind. 7. The Connells slipped 2 days later. The rain cleared. Miss Marple found herself invited, along with several villagers, to the Colonel's greenhouse to view his orchids. A gesture of goodwill, he claimed, to dispel morbid talk. While the others admired the blooms, Miss Marple lingered near the potting bench. Among the tools lay a cup, plain china, slightly stained inside. She picked it up delicately. "Ah," said the Colonel behind her. "That's nothing, Miss Marple. I use it for mixing fertilizer." "Indeed," she said, turning it so the light caught the faint ring of dark residue. "Such a curious place to keep a teacup." He laughed too quickly. "I'll have it washed out." "I should," she said mildly. "Some residues, Colonel, are rather stubborn." As she left, she noticed a faint nick on his hand, fresh, as though from a broken bottle. 8. A new witness that evening brought an unexpected caller, Mr. Peters, landlord of the Blue Boar. He was uncomfortable in Miss Marple's parlour, hat twisting in his hands. "I wouldn't have come, ma'am, only it's been on my mind," he began. "Saturday night, the Major had a bit of a row here, loud enough for half the bar to hear." "With the Colonel?" Miss Marple looked up. "Indeed. Something about money owed. The Major accused him of cheating at cards, called him a coward. Bad word for an old soldier." The Colonel walked out red as a beet. "Thank you, Mr. Peters," she said softly. "That is most enlightening." When he left, she sat very still. A quarrel, a bottle of cyanide within reach, a widow conveniently consoled, pieces sliding together, but not yet locking. And then another thought came, quiet and disquieting. If the Colonel had poisoned the coffee, How had he known the Major would drink it at that precise moment in church? Unless someone had ensured that he did. 9. The widow's visit. The following morning Lydia Penrith came to Miss Marple unannounced, dressed in mourning but with an odd brightness in her eyes. "I hear the inspector suspects me," she said bluntly. "I thought perhaps you could tell me whether that is true." Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "Suspects is a strong word, my dear, but questions naturally arise." Lydia leaned forward. "If I'd wanted my husband dead, I'd have done it long ago." "Hey," she stopped, biting her lip. "He was not kind, Miss Marple. Not in private, but I endured it." "I imagine you did," Miss Marple said softly. "And others noticed, even when you thought they did not. Colonel Arkwright, perhaps." Lydia's cheeks flushed. "He was a friend. Nothing more. People will say what they please." "They will," Miss Marple agreed. "Yet you came to me because, I think, you fear what the truth may reveal, not merely about your husband's death, but about yourself." Lydia's composure cracked. She began to weep silently. "He threatened to ruin me," she whispered. "He discovered letters. Old, foolish letters I wrote to another man before the war. He said he'd change his will, leave me penniless, make it known to everyone." Miss Marple handed her a handkerchief. "And so you thought it merciful that death intervened?" Lydia looked up sharply. "You don't think I think," said Miss Marple kindly, "that providence and malice often wear the same disguise. But murder, dear, seldom proceeds from one emotion alone. It needs opportunity and assistance." A trap is set. That evening Miss Marple visited Inspector Craddock. "If you wish to see our murderer, Inspector, you must come to the church tomorrow at 10. Bring your men quietly." "Tomorrow?" "Because," she said, eyes bright, "I am going to knit in the vestry, and someone will find that intolerable." The Craddock stared. "You mean to act as bait?" "Oh no, my dear Inspector. I mean to tidy up a few loose ends." 11. The confrontation in the vestry morning came, crisp and clear. The church was empty save for Miss Marple, her knitting basket beside her. She pretended to fuss with hymn sheets, humming softly. Minutes passed, then footsteps echoed behind her. She did not turn. "Good morning, Mr. Hewlett," she said calmly. The organist froze. How did you know it was me?" "One learns to distinguish footsteps," she said, still knitting. "Yours have a musical hesitation." He swallowed. "I only came to collect my scores." "Of course. And perhaps to remove that little bottle of silver polish you keep near the organ, the one that smells faintly of cyanide." His face drained of color. "You can't prove anything." "No," she said gently. "But the inspector can. He found traces of silver polish on the thermos lid. You see, Mr. Hewlett, you used the poison already diluted for cleaning. Enough remained to kill." He trembled. "It wasn't meant for him. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him ill. He'd threatened to expose my sister, ruin her reputation. She loved him, foolish girl, and he laughed at her. I thought a dose would teach him humility." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, then stilled. "Pride, my dear man, is a poor tutor, and cyanide is never instructive, only final." At that moment Inspector Craddock stepped from behind the door. "I heard enough, Hewlett." The organist sank onto a pew, head in hands. "I never meant to kill him," he muttered. "I only poured a few drops into his cup before the service. I thought he'd sip, feel faint and go home. But he drank it all." "And the scream?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "My sister. She realized what I'd done. She told the maid to make sure he drank the coffee, thinking it was only a mild drug. When he died, she screamed." The aftermath. As they led Hewlett away, the sunlight poured through the stained glass, bathing the nave in a strange serenity. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You'd suspected him all along, hadn't you?" "Not at first," she admitted. "But when I smelled polish at his house, and remembered that faint chemical odor in the vestry, it seemed likely. The glove and the widow, the colonel and his quarrel. They were the embroidery. The real thread was simpler wounded pride and mistaken mercy." He shook his head. "You make it sound almost tragic." "It is tragic, Inspector," she said quietly. "All murders are. They begin with selfishness and end with sorrow. But at least St. Mary Mead may sleep in peace again." The 13 evening reflections. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the last light fade over the hedgerows. The air smelled of damp earth and distant smoke. Another case closed, another sin uncovered beneath the polished manners of village life. She lifted her teacup and smiled faintly. "Human nature, Raymond," she murmured to the absent nephew who so often doubted her. "It never changes. The setting does, that's all." Her cat purred at her feet. The clock struck 9. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, an owl called once, twice, then silence. Peace, fragile but genuine, returned to St. Mary Mead, and yet Miss Marple knew that peace, like virtue, must always be watched, for where people gather, in pews or parlors, there will always be secrets waiting to be whispered. The storm had passed, leaving the village washed and glistening. Clouds hung low over the church spire, and puddles mirrored the greying sky. Inside her small parlour at Cherry Tree Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, though her hands were still. Her mind was turning, quietly, relentlessly, over every detail of what had happened in the church. The confession of Mr. Hewlett had tied many threads together, yet there were knots that troubled her. Confessions, she had long observed, were rather like hats. People chose the ones that suited them best, whether or not they truly fitted. Something about Hewlett's story rang slightly false. He claimed to have wanted only to make the Major ill, to humble him. But poison was a grave tool for so mild a lesson. And there was the curious matter of Lydia Penrith's fear, the Connell's agitation, and that faint, haunting scream at the moment of death. Miss Marple gazed into the flames, her reflection flickering there, fragile but unbending. Human nature, she murmured again, so tidy in appearance, so tangled beneath. 1. The uneasy calm 3 days after Hewlett's arrest, the village resumed its rhythm. The newspapers carried modest headlines, organist confesses to church death, yet among the villagers, conversation lingered, carried like pollen from garden to garden. Mrs. Hartnell declared it a disgrace. Miss Weatherby insisted that such things never happened before the war. And Miss Marple listened, smiling faintly, while she collected her weekly groceries. At the counter of the village shop, she encountered Colonel Arkwright, who looked thinner and older. He greeted her politely, but there was no ease in his manner. "Tragic business," he said. "Never thought poor Hewlett capable of it. Still, the law's the law." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, carefully selecting a tin of tea. "Though I do wonder, Colonel, how the law will regard intent in this case. After all, he says it was only to make the Major ill." The Colonel shifted uncomfortably. "A man's responsible for the result, not his intention. And between you and me, I can't say I'm sorry the Major's gone. Brutal fellow." Miss Marple's blue eyes lifted to his face. "Oh, I think you are sorry, Colonel. Sorry for more than one reason." He frowned, about to protest, but her expression disarmed him. He cleared his throat. "Good day to you, Miss Marple," and left rather quickly. She watched him go. There was guilt in his stride, not of murder perhaps, but of concealment. And concealment was often the shadow that pointed toward the true light. 2. A visit to the widow that afternoon. Miss Marple took her umbrella and walked to the old rectory. Lydia Penrith received her in the parlour, dressed no longer in black but in a soft grey gown. There was a vase of white lilies on the piano, a symbol, Miss Marple thought, of innocence claimed, not necessarily earned. "My dear Miss Marple," Lydia said with weary grace, "I must thank you for all you've done. I hear the inspector speaks very highly of your help." "I have merely been an observer," said Miss Marple modestly, "though I am not entirely certain our story has finished." Lydia's brow creased. "Finished? But the man confessed." "Confession," Miss Marple said, "is a curious thing. It tells us what a person wishes to be believed, not necessarily what is. I wonder, Mrs. Penrith, when you told your maid to take the thermos early that morning, did you notice the smell of almonds?" Lydia looked startled. "Almonds? Nor why? Because bitter almonds are the unmistakable scent of cyanide, and I dare say even a faint trace would have lingered in the air." Lydia stood quite still. "You think I knew," she said slowly. "You think I wanted him dead?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. She leaned forward, eyes gentle. "I think you loved once, Mrs. Penrith, and were disappointed. And that you sought peace, but peace is never purchased cheaply." There was silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Then Lydia whispered, "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded. "No, I believe you did not. But you knew he would die, and you let it happen." The colour drained from Lydia's face. She sank into a chair, trembling. "How did you know?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "you screamed before he fell." 3. The second scream. Lydia stared at her in horror. "No one could have noticed that." "But I did," Miss Marple said kindly. "I was in the third pew, to the left of the aisle." The scream began the instant the Major raised the cup to his lips. "You could not have known he was dying, only that he was drinking. Which means, my dear, that you knew what was in that cup." Lydia covered her face with her hands. "I tried to stop him," she whispered. I wanted to warn him, but I couldn't. My voice came out as a scream. Miss Marple watched her silently. So you knew the coffee was poisoned? Yes, she said brokenly. I knew, but too late to undo it. How did you know, Mrs. Penrith? Lydia's shoulders shook. The night before his death, I found the Colonel and my husband arguing in the garden. The Colonel was furious. He said the Major had blackmailed him over some old army scandal. When they parted, the Colonel dropped a small bottle. I picked it up later. It was labeled cyanide. I was terrified. I put it in the cupboard, meaning to return it in the morning. Miss Marple's voice was very calm. But you didn't? No. When I went to make the coffee for the service, I saw the Colonel outside by the vestry. He looked pale, agitated. Then he came in and offered to carry the thermos for me. I let him. When I next saw it, the lid felt different. She shuddered. In that moment, I knew he had done something dreadful. I wanted to stop it, but when the Major drank, I froze. The scream just escaped. Miss Marple rose and laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. You poor child, she murmured. You have been carrying that weight all alone. Lydia looked up, eyes red. Will you tell the police? I shall tell the truth, said Miss Marple softly. And the truth is never so simple as guilt or innocence. 4. The Colonel's confession. That evening Miss Marple requested Inspector Craddock to accompany her to Colonel Arkwright's residence. The man received them stiffly, standing by the hearth with a tumbler of brandy. To what do I owe the honor? He asked coolly. Miss Marple answered gently. To your conscience, Colonel. He blinked. My conscience. Yes. It must be a very heavy one, after all these days. He tried to laugh. You'll have to explain yourself, Miss Marple. I shall. Mr. Hewlett may have confessed to adding poison, but I think you know, as I do, that the true mixture was your doing. The glass in his hand trembled. That's absurd. Miss Marple went on quietly, her voice low but firm. You quarrelled with the Major over money. You feared he'd expose your debts and destroy your standing in the regiment's charity board. You obtained cyanide from your greenhouse store, ostensibly for insecticide. You intended to frighten him, perhaps, but anger is a poor companion to reason. When you carried that thermos to the vestry, you saw an opportunity too simple to resist. Rubbish, he burst out. You've no proof. No, she smiled sadly. When I visited your greenhouse, Colonel, I noticed your cup, the one you said you used for fertilizer. The laboratory found traces of the same chemical compound there as in the thermos, and the small cut on your hand. It matched a shard of broken glass from the bottle in your shed. His face whitened. For a moment he seemed about to speak, then turned away, staring into the fire. Craddock stepped forward. It will go easier if you tell us the truth, Arkwright. The Colonel's shoulders sagged. It was meant to be justice, he muttered. He ruined men in the regiment, blackmail, extortion, even drove one to take his life. When he threatened to expose my debts, I snapped. I thought if I slipped him a dose, he'd be too ill to attend the meeting the next day. I didn't mean to kill him outright. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. But you did. And Lydia knew. He turned sharply. She said nothing. She screamed. Miss Marple said softly, sometimes silence has many forms. 5. Truth entwined. The confession was taken down formally, and Craddock left with the Colonel in custody. Miss Marple walked home alone through the mist, her umbrella tapping softly on the pavement. It was nearly dark when she reached Cherry Tree Cottage. The lamps glowed golden in the windows, and the kettle whistled gently as she entered. She sat by the fire, her thoughts solemn. 2 men, each believing he alone had delivered justice, each blind to the harm that righteous anger can bring. Mr. Hewlett had placed diluted poison, meaning only to humble. Colonel Arkwright had added more, meaning only to disable. Between them, they had created death, and Lydia's silence had sealed it. It was, she thought, a perfect triangle of human frailty, fear, pride, and love. 6. The inspector calls the next morning. Inspector Craddock arrived again, looking more weary than triumphant. Well, Miss Marple, he said, you were right. The Colonel's admitted it all. We'll charge him with manslaughter, though the lawyers may argue over degrees. As for Hewlett, I'll recommend leniency. He was more fool than fiend. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. But tell me, Inspector, what of Mrs. Penrith? She'll be cleared. She acted out of fear, not complicity. Still, she's a broken woman. Miss Marple sighed. Some women spend half their lives learning to appear calm, and the other half trying to forget why. Craddock smiled faintly. You've a very tender heart, Miss Marple. Oh no, she said, eyes twinkling. merely an experienced one. 7. Lydia's farewell. A week later, Lydia Penrith prepared to leave the village. The old rectory was sold, its windows shuttered. Miss Marple came to bid her goodbye. "You're certain about London?" she asked. "Yes," Lydia said quietly. "There's nothing for me here now. I've a cousin in Kensington who's offered me a room." Miss Marple took her hands. "Then may peace go with you, my dear. Remember, running from sorrow is quite useless. It travels well." Lydia gave a faint smile. "I'll try to live better. To forget. One forgets nothing," said Miss Marple softly. "But one learns to live with remembrance. And that is something greater." They parted on the garden path. Lydia turned once to wave before the carriage took her down the lane, her figure dissolving into the morning mist. 8. The return of silence. The weeks that followed were uneventful. The church bells rang again each Sunday. The villagers once more discussed weather and gardens. Mr. Hewlett's cottage stood empty, the Conal's house locked. St. Mary Mead had folded the scandal neatly into its history, like a letter placed discreetly at the bottom of a drawer. Miss Marple resumed her knitting circle, her teas, her quiet walks to the post office. Yet every time the organ played during morning service, she felt a small chill along her spine, remembering the echo of that dreadful scream. It was not fear precisely, rather reverence, for life's fragility, and for the strange ways truth reveals itself only to those patient enough to listen. 9. Miss Marple reflects. One evening as dusk gathered, Miss Marple sat by her window overlooking the green. A robin hopped along the hedge. She poured herself a cup of tea and opened her notebook. A habit she kept from years of observation. She wrote, "Murder rarely begins in malice. It begins in self-deception. Each person convinced they act for good or necessity." Hewlett thought he was defending his sister. The Colonel believed he was protecting honor. Lydia believed silence would prevent scandal. Yet all were wrong. Evil seldom appears with horns. It wears our own faces. She paused, listening to the faint whistle of the wind through the eaves. "And yet," she whispered, "there is always mercy in truth, even when it comes too late." She closed the notebook and smiled faintly. Another mystery ended. But human nature, thank goodness, never quite solved. The 10. The final revelation. A fortnight later, Inspector Craddock called once more, this time purely socially. "Over tea and scones," he said. "You know, Miss Marple, there's one thing I can't quite fathom. When you set that trap in the vestry, how were you so certain Hewlett would come?" "Because," Miss Marple said with a mischievous glint, "the guilty always return to the scene of their guilt. It's rather like weeding, Inspector. Pull one up, and you'll find another sprouting nearby." He laughed. "You'll put me out of a job one of these days." "Oh, nonsense," she said warmly. "I merely observe what others overlook. And that is all detective work truly is." As he rose to leave, she added thoughtfully, "There was something else, of course. The scream. Had it not occurred, I might never have noticed the timing. That single sound told me more than any evidence could." Craddock nodded slowly. "It was the start and end of the whole affair, wasn't it?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The scream during morning prayer. A cry not of guilt, but of conscience." She watched from the window as he walked away down the lane. The evening sun burned low behind the church tower, gilding the stones with pale gold. The bells began to toll softly for evensong. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Outside life went on. Gardens tended, letters posted, tea poured. But beneath it all, she knew, the old mysteries of the human heart continued, as eternal as the chime of the church clock. 11. Epilogue. The lesson of the scream. That Sunday, she attended service once more. The pews were filled, the hymn sweet and steady. Yet when the organ struck the opening chords, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the vestry door. The place where death had entered so quietly. She thought of Lydia, of Hewlett, of the Colonel. 3 souls, each undone by a secret they had thought too small to matter. And she thought of that scream, sharp, terrible, yet in its way holy, for it had been the sound of truth tearing through the polite silence of the village. When the service ended, Miss Marple stepped into the sunlight, her smile serene. "So much wickedness," she murmured, "and yet, so much grace." She paused by the gate, watching a pair of children chase a hoop across the green, their laughter rising into the air. Then she turned toward home, her footsteps light on the path, her mind already at peace. For in St. Mary Mead, as in all the world, morning prayers would always rise, and sometimes with them, a single scream to remind the living that secrets, however buried, must one day be heard. The soft golden light of late afternoon filtered through the stained, glass windows of St. Mildred's Church, casting pools of crimson and sapphire over the worn stone floor. The tumult of the past week seemed at last to have ebbed into a pensive quiet. Outside, a few parishioners gathered in muted conversation, speaking in hushed tones that bore both relief and disbelief. For though the crime was solved, the peace of their small village would never quite return untouched. Inspector Craddock stood by the chancel rail, hat in hand, gazing thoughtfully at Miss Marple. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said at last, shaking his head in quiet admiration. "I should have known when you insisted we check the prayer book and the communion wine." Miss Marple smiled gently, her gloved hands folded over her handbag. "Oh, my dear Inspector, one mustn't be too harsh on oneself. Appearances, as we've seen, can be most deceiving, especially when piety and propriety are used as curtains to hide sin." Craddock gave a low whistle. And to think that the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pembroke of all people, was the one behind it. She fooled nearly everyone. Miss Marple's eyes softened, not with sentiment but with a deep understanding of human frailty. "Yes, fooling others was never her greatest achievement, Inspector. It was how she fooled herself. That is the tragedy of it." The drawing-room revelation 2 hours earlier, they had gathered in the vicarage sitting-room for what the inspector grimly called a little clarification. The air was tense. Mrs. Pembroke sat rigidly on the edge of her armchair, her black morning dress impeccable, her eyes hollow and dry. Across from her, the vicar, Reverend Pembroke, looked utterly broken, his faith shaken, his face pale with disbelief. The other villagers, Alderton, Mrs. Chudley, and young Alice Harper, were present too, each carrying their own mixture of guilt, curiosity, and relief. Craddock had done his duty in plain terms. "Mrs. Pembroke, it's my responsibility to inform you that we've gathered enough evidence to charge you with the murder of Miss Beatrice Clay." A shiver ran through the room. Mrs. Pembroke gave a small, trembling laugh. "Murder? That frail old gossip. She died of fright, Inspector. Everyone knows she was weak of heart." "That's quite true," Miss Marple interjected softly, "but the scream that morning was not hers. It came from you." Every face turned toward her. The old lady sat serenely by the window, teacup untouched. "Oh yes," Miss Marple went on. "It was your scream, Mrs. Pembroke. Miss Clay never had time to cry out." Miss Marple's explanation. "The facts were all before us," Miss Marple said, her gentle voice filling the stunned silence. Miss Clay had threatened to expose something she'd seen that could ruin reputations. She had been in the vestry early that morning, sorting through hymnals for the choir. I suspect she found the small bottle of poison Mrs. Pembroke had hidden in the communion wine cupboard." Mrs. Pembroke stiffened, but Miss Marple continued unhurriedly, her eyes half-lidded as if recalling a half-forgotten memory. "Miss Clay was not an unkind woman, merely an inquisitive one. She confronted you, didn't she, in the vestry, just before morning prayer? There was a quarrel, a whispered argument. The chalice of wine was on the table, prepared for the service. And in that moment of panic you pushed her. Her head struck the marble step of the altar. Death was instantaneous." Mrs. Pembroke's breath hitched audibly. "The scream," Miss Marple said softly, "was yours. Not of guilt yet, but of shock. You quickly realized what had happened. The vicar was already in the nave, and the choir had begun to gather. You dragged her body behind the curtain, then poured away the poisoned wine. After all, it was never meant for her, was it?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "Then who was it meant for?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the vicar. "For your husband, Reverend. Forgive me for saying so." The vicar's hands trembled upon his knees. Mrs. Pembroke's face crumpled, the mask of years slipping away in an instant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it was meant for him. I couldn't bear it. The letters, the whispers, the shame. Beatrice Clay had been blackmailing me for months, ever since she found out about the woman he comforted during her illness. I thought she would destroy him, and I couldn't let that happen." Miss Marple's tone was compassionate but unyielding. "So you planned to poison your husband to silence the scandal forever, to make it appear as though grief had overcome him. But instead, you took another life by accident, and then tried to bury both your guilt and your conscience beneath layers of devotion." The Mrs. Pembroke sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I loved him, Miss Marple. I did it out of love." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but piercing. "Love that destroys cannot truly be love, my dear. It is only fear wearing love's clothing." The aftermath, the confession, came quietly after that. There were no more protests, no hysterics, just a subdued dignity that somehow made the tragedy even greater. When Mrs. Pembroke was led away, the vicar sank into his chair, head bowed, muttering fragments of prayer that seemed to dissolve into the heavy air. Outside, the bells of St. Mildred's began to toll the evening hour. The sound carried across the churchyard, mingling with the rustle of autumn leaves and the distant bleating of sheep. Miss Marple lingered near the gate, watching the sunlight fade behind the lich gate. She always found that evil in the village did not vanish with the arrest. It merely retreated, like a shadow waiting for dusk. Inspector Craddock joined her, lighting a cigarette. "Do you ever tire of it, Miss Marple? Seeing the worst of what people are capable of?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, not at all, my dear Inspector. I see the best of them too. Even in Mrs. Pembroke there was once kindness, misguided, but real. Evil seldom begins as evil. It starts as weakness, and weakness, left unchecked, becomes something far darker." Craddock exhaled slowly. "You've more faith in human nature than I do." "Not faith, exactly," Miss Marple said with a twinkle. "Merely observation. You see, when one has lived as long as I have, one notices patterns. People are much the same everywhere. Only the curtains and the teapots differ." Epilogue: The garden at dusk. A week later, St. Mary Mead, or rather, its neighbour village of Milchester, was returning to normal. The scandal had faded into whispered recollections, the kind exchanged over knitting circles and shop counters. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the fading rose petals brushing her gloved fingers as she pruned. Her nephew Raymond's letter lay open beside her teacup, full of literary ambitions and London chatter. She looked up as the sound of church bells drifted faintly from the distance. "The world never does quite change," she murmured. "Sin and sorrow have their way, but so too does redemption." A small bird fluttered down onto the path, cocking its head at her. Miss Marple smiled. "You see, even you know there's order in things." Her housekeeper, the ever-practical Florence, appeared at the doorway. "Evening tea, Miss Marple?" "Yes, thank you, Florence. And perhaps a bit of seed cake. One ought to celebrate when a matter is finally settled." Florence smiled. "They say the vicar's gone to stay with his sister in Devon. Poor man, but they also say—" Miss Marple chuckled softly. "My dear Florence, they always say, and usually they're quite wrong." As Florence disappeared inside, Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the sunset, its colors soft, forgiving, almost merciful. She lifted her teacup, eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. "The scream during morning prayer," she whispered. "Poor soul." But even that, in the end, was only the sound of a conscience awakening. The garden fell silent save for the evening birdsong, and once again, the world of St. Mary Mead, and all the fragile hearts within it, seemed to exhale in peace.